The night before he died, Jesus sat down for one last meal with his closest friends. He knew what was coming: the arrest, the trial, the cross. And instead of running from it, he picked up a piece of bread, broke it in his hand, and said something strange. "This is my body." Then he lifted a cup of wine and said something stranger still. "This is my blood." What did he mean? Was this poetry, symbolism, or was Jesus in that upper room explaining in his own words, before it happened, exactly what his death was about to accomplish? That's what we're unpacking today. Before we get to that meal, let's set the scene. Jesus is arrested at night, dragged before the Jewish council, and put on trial. And here's what's odd if you know anything about the ancient Jewish legal process. This trial breaks almost every rule in the book. Capital cases were supposed to happen only in daylight. They required at least two independent witnesses who agree with each other. There was supposed to be a full day's gap before a guilty verdict to allow room for mercy. None of that happened here. Even the Roman governor, Pilate, looked at this case and said essentially, "I find no fault in this man." So here's the question we're sitting with. If Jesus was innocent, and if the trial was rigged, why didn't he fight it? Why didn't he defend himself? The answer he gives isn't, "I had no power to stop it." It's the opposite. He tells his disciples he could have called down more than 12 legions of angels if he wanted to. He wasn't trapped. He was choosing something. And at that Last Supper, just hours before all this happened, he tells them why. Picture the scene. Jesus and his 12 disciples are gathered for the Passover meal, the same meal Jewish families had shared for over thousands of years. Remember the night God rescued their ancestor out of slavery in Egypt. In the middle of the familiar ritual, Jesus does something unexpected. He takes a piece of bread, gives thanks, breaks it, and hands it to his disciples. "Take, eat, this is my body." Then he takes a cup of wine and says, "This is my blood of the new covenant, which is poured out for many." This isn't just saying, it's closer to a piece of street theater. Jesus is acting out his death before it happens, breaking the bread, pouring the wine, and then he tells them in plain words what the action means. To understand what he meant, we need to trace two phrases back to their roots: "poured out for many" and "blood of the covenant." Both of them came straight out of the Old Testament, and both of them would have hit his Jewish disciples like a lightning bolt. The phrase "poured out for many" isn't random. It's a direct echo of one of the most famous passages in the entire Old Testament, Isaiah chapter 53, written roughly 700 years before Jesus was born. Isaiah describes a mysterious figure called the suffering servant of the Lord. This servant is crushed, pierced, and punished, not for his own wrongdoing, but for the sins of others. Isaiah says this servant will pour out his soul unto death, and that by his knowledge my righteous servant shall justify many, for he shall bear their iniquities. When Jesus uses that same language, "poured out for many," at the Last Supper, he is making a claim. He's saying, "I'm that servant." This is what tomorrow's death is actually about. It isn't a tragic miscarriage of justice happening to me. It's the fulfillment of what the prophet said would happen through me. This is a crucial point. Jesus isn't a victim of a story. He's identifying himself as the answer to a prophecy that had puzzled Jewish scholars for centuries. Who is the servant who suffers for others? Jesus said, "It's me, and it's happening tomorrow." Now, let's look at the second phrase, blood of the covenant. This one goes back even further, over 1,000 years earlier, to Mount Sinai, when Moses led the people of Israel out of Egypt. At Sinai, Moses built an altar, made a sacrifice, and took the blood of that sacrifice and threw it on the people, saying, "This is the blood of the covenant, which the Lord has made with you." That moment sealed the relationship. Israel will be God's people, and God will be their God. It is formal, binding agreement, sealed in blood. So when Jesus lifts the cup and says, "This is my blood of the new covenant," his disciples would have immediately thought of Sinai. He's saying, what Moses did with animal blood on a mountain, I am about to do with my own blood on a cross. This isn't a replacement of the old agreement out of nowhere. It's a fulfillment of something the prophet Jeremiah had already predicted centuries earlier. A day when God will make new covenant with his people, one written not in stone tablets, but on the human heart. In other words, Jesus is telling his disciple, tomorrow isn't an accident. Tomorrow is a covenant-making event, the most important one in history. Here's a question worth sitting with honestly. Why did it have to be death? Couldn't God simply forgive people without all this? The consistent picture across the Old Testament is that the life and blood are treated as deeply connected, atonement, the covering over and removal of sin's penalty, is tied to a life being given up. That's the logic behind the entire sacrificial system. An animal's life given so that the people's guilt could be addressed. But animal sacrifices, repeated year after year, were never going to be a permanent solution. They were more like a temporary placeholder, always pointing forward to something greater. What Jesus is saying at the Last Supper is that he is that greater fulfillment. Not an animal standing in a symbolic place, but God himself, in human flesh, absorbing the cost personally. This is why the writer of Hebrews, later in the New Testament, will put it plainly. It was impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to actually deal with sin at its root. Something more was needed. Someone more was needed. So let's come back to where we started. Jesus standing silently before the unjust court, offering no defense. Once you understand what he said at the table the night before, his silence in the courtroom makes complete sense. He wasn't silent because he was powerless. He was silent because he had already explained, hours earlier, exactly what was about to happen and why. He wasn't a victim swept up in someone else's plan. He describes himself using Isaiah's language as the one who pours out his life, an active, voluntary act, not something merely done to him. The cross, in Jesus' own understanding of it, wasn't a defeat interrupted by a resurrection 3 days later. It was the plan. the fulfillment of Isaiah's suffering servant, and sealing of Jeremiah's new covenant, both happening in a single afternoon on a hill outside Jerusalem. So, when we ask, what did the cross mean to Jesus? His own words gives us the answer. Spoken the night before it happened. It meant fulfilling what Isaiah had written 7 centuries earlier about a servant who suffers for others. And it meant sealing what Jeremiah had promised, a new covenant, a renewed relationship between God and his people. This time sealed not with the blood of animals, but with his own. That's not a story that ends in tragedy. According to Jesus himself, it's a story that ends in a table set for many, a meal, an invitation, and a promise kept. Next time, we will look at what happens 3 days later. The event Jesus' followers said changed everything, the resurrection, and what it meant as God's own verdict on everything Jesus had just claimed.